Welcome to the By Way of Commandment podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the finer points of his doctrine. Join us as we study the gospel through the scriptures and standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think what I'm most interested in is to hear kind of how both of you met and started working together, because Brian, as we were talking a minute ago, this is certainly not the first time you guys have collaborated on a project. So how far back does your friendship go? How far back have you been working together? And ultimately, what led to this particular project that became the Joseph Smith's Uncanonized Revelations book?
It's a great question. We actually met in our undergraduate studies at BYU. We were both doing ancient Near Eastern studies, and I'll always remember Stephen because he was already a prolific writer at that time. So I admired him for that, and he was someone I wanted to get to know and work with in the future. So that's kind of where we met during the program, and we continued to keep correspondence as we continued our graduate studies. He's getting close to finishing up. I'm getting there as well. But just through different conferences, we met at the Joseph Smith Papers conferences a couple times, and we had talked about working with each other. And one of the ways that we had kind of reconnected was Stephen can speak to this, but he works for one of the jobs he has is working for the B.H. Roberts Foundation, and I work for the Church History Library, and we were able to collaborate a lot. And at the Church History Library, we were able to get them some documents that they could use for their website, Mormoner.org, and that's kind of how we started a collaboration together.
Yeah, I think Brian's kind of hit all the highlights there. It's kind of been in some ways a long and winding road, to use the Beatles lyrics, between us as undergrads at BYU to the book that we've now just co-written together. And it's been fun along the way. Yeah, conferences and various ideas that we sort of back and forth. Brian's my point man there, the Church History Library. It's fun having a guy on the inside, as it were, right? So anytime I need to get hooked up with some cool sources, I can, hey, Brian, how's it going, right? So through my capacity, mostly with the B.H. Roberts Foundation. So yeah, I think Brian's hit it nicely on the head there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, one thing I'll say is that the kind of genesis of this project was when Stephen and I believe we were at MHA, Mormon Historical Association conference. And for my master's thesis at Utah State University, I wrote on Orson Pratt's expansion of the Doctrine and Covenants in the 1870s. And that was a kind of a seminal project that hadn't really been written about. And he added 26 sections to the Doctrine and Covenants and took out another section under the direction of Brigham Young. And so when I was talking to Stephen about this, I told him that, as part of this project, I had compiled a list of uncanonized Joseph Smith revelations, and quite separately, Stephen had done the same thing. And so, I think it was Stephen who was like, well, let's write about that. I think this will be a useful thing for people to have. And we kind of went from there. So.
All right. What's the other side of the story, Stephen?
I don't know if there is another side. I think, again, Brian just kind of summarized it nicely. The creation of our new book, sort of like simultaneous invention, right? Where we both just kind of had this idea in our head about doing something like this. And it must have been at that, was it at the Church History Conference where we first kind of batted this idea around? As he said, you'd had it. Yeah, we were just like, hey, wait, you're doing a list of these things too? Well, we got to talk about this. And so as deranged as academics are wont to do, we independently come up with these ideas, and then we decide, let's write a book about it, right? And so that was, just sort of the long and short of it. No, nothing much more fancier than that, really.
Now, because you guys are coming at this individually and then coming together as a collaboration, did you notice during this whole project that you guys had maybe some differences in the way that you approached the research and the project as a whole? Or did you have maybe some slightly different interests that drove you to this to begin with?
Well, Brian probably, I think he would say, certainly his interest in the history of the canon, right, was a big impetus for why he wanted to get involved with this. Uh, the existence of revelations that are not canonized, but are nevertheless there, they sort of raise this question of what do we do with them, and what does this mean to have an open canon where potentially one day they could be added. So we discussed, for example, in the introduction to our book, how people have known about these revelations for over 100 years. Like these revelations haven't been a secret to anybody. And so the decision whether or not to canonize them is an interesting one. And so I think Brian was kind of approaching it from that perspective, kind of the history of the canon, you could say. I'm approaching them kind of from the perspective of these are Joseph Smith documents that give us some kind of insight into who Joseph Smith was and what his religious thinking was. And right, like these texts he produced, like what does that tell us about him and his life and his ministry? And so you can also approach these documents from that perspective as well. So maybe Brian disagrees or has another perspective, but I can't think of any sort of substantive differences that we had in terms of like, okay, we're both coming from this as Latter-day Saints who believe Joseph Smith was a prophet, who believe that these revelations are actual revelations, right? Like, and we approach them as such and try to understand them as such. Maybe we have some slight different, I would say, not methodological, but different like historiographical perspectives on what these things are. But I can't think of anything too dramatic where, we like had a clear divergence and what are we going to do with this or how are we going to approach this? I think it was very complementary from the beginning.
No, yeah, I completely agree. I do think that Stephen gave a great summation there. It's really, my interests really stem from, why aren't these in the canon? What does that mean? If they were put in the canon, what would that mean practically? And like Stephen said, he's interested in kind of understanding the revelations for kind of the revelatory mind, right, of Joseph Smith and how these were received. And my interests are lots of kind of the implications of how do we look at these within the canon and without the canon.
Yeah. Stephen, you've done a lot of work on the Book of Abraham. I know you worked with a number of individuals and collaborated on a number of different projects and papers related to the Book of Abraham. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to this side of things that your interests lie in terms of what is a revelation. The book is aptly titled Joseph Smith's Uncanonized Revelations. So maybe it would benefit us and the listeners if we could kind of lay out our terms right at the front. What constitutes a revelation? And then maybe, Brian, we can also discuss why we're looking at uncanonized revelations and maybe what constitutes a revelation if it's not going to be canonized and maybe some of the implications there.
Yeah, excellent question, because if we're going to include a book on revelations, our very first question is, what are we going to count, right? What are we going to include as a revelation? So we had to decide from the beginning, and we lay out in our introduction the criteria that we use to decide what are going to be quote unquote uncanonized revelations or not. So obviously the most immediately obvious thing is, has it ever been in the canon, right? If it's never been in the canon, then it's uncanonized. So that's easy enough. So we can find those sources that in one shape or another have never appeared in the canon of scripture. So what do we do after that? Okay, because you have statements from Joseph Smith where he might say, I feel inspired by the Lord to say this or whatever, right? Well, okay, is that a revelation? Is this some kind of a inspired teaching or something like that? Where do you demark that? And what we kind of landed on was these are texts that are presented to readers like what we see in the Doctrine and Covenants as the voice of God. Okay, so that's a pretty clear, distinct way you can decide if something's a revelation or a purported revelation is, does it purport to be coming from God? Either as a verbatim transcript of what God is saying, or as you can say maybe perhaps a prophetic close paraphrase to what God is revealing to the prophet, right? So most of the revelations, if not all of them, are well, not all of them, but many of them are a, thus saith the Lord unto my servant Joseph Smith Jr. concerning such and such, right? And then you're off to the races with a divine pronouncement. That was kind of the main thing we thought would work as a is a kind of a criteria for this is a revelation, because we don't have to debate, well, Joseph Smith taught this thing and it's inspired and it contains true principles. But is it a revelation or not? Well, that's a little fuzzy. But you can clearly see, thus saith the Lord unto Joseph Smith, my servant, concerning this is my will concerning Bishop Partridge or whatever, right? Like that you can clearly see as a revelation. So that's what we decided to focus on is these are divine pronouncements or prophetic pronouncements said to be received by divine revelation that are presented either in the first person voice of God or as a close prophetic paraphrase of what God has revealed to the prophet in a way that fairly clearly constitutes a revelation, meaning a communication outside of the prophet himself, right? So that's sort of our main criteria. I don't know if Brian wants to add anything else, or if I kind of succinctly described there what was going on. It became a little tricky at some points because we had to make sort of editorial judgment. Do we consider this or that document a revelation or not? Because it sounds like a revelation, but it could just be Joseph Smith speaking in a kind of quasi-biblical sort of manner. You know what I mean? Like, so there were some cases, or for example, there are some documents where it's like so for example, Joseph Smith writes out by hand a blessing to, I think it's Sarah Ann Whitney. And it's in the Joseph Smith Papers website, and it's this blessing to Sarah Ann Whitney, who was one of his plural wives, and to her family. And in the middle of it, he says, "For thus saith the Lord," and then there's a couple sentences of like a "thus saith the Lord" statement. But like, is this Joseph Smith in this bigger letter? Do we excise those two sentences because he was saying "thus saith the Lord," or is this Joseph Smith kind of paraphrasing, something? So it gets kind of fuzzy in some places, but ultimately we felt pretty clear that like, if it's a revelatory pronouncement, God speaking in first person, or a close paraphrase of God from the prophet, that constitutes a revelation. So we're not denying that there is inspiration in Joseph Smith's other teachings, perhaps, right? Or that he didn't have some divine influence in his other teachings, but we don't call those revelations per se, unless if they are presented as such.
Yeah, the one other thing I would add is that in the life of Joseph Smith, sometimes some of the early members of the church would listen to his counsel. They would ask him, "What should I do concerning, X and X thing?" And he would give them counsel, but they wouldn't really treat it as a revelation. And so they would say, "Can you receive a revelation about this? Can you ask the Lord?" And then when he would go into this rhetorical space where he's speaking in the name of the Lord, then they would take it more seriously. I liken it to going to, if a bishop's giving you counsel, you can kind of take it as maybe this is inspired counsel or something. But if he's claiming, this is a revelation, it might be treated a little differently in your life. And that's how people treated Joseph Smith's revelations as well.
Yeah, awesome. I'm reminded of a time when I received a call from a bishop to assume a role within the ward, and it was something that I knew was going to be more difficult and time consuming and things like that. I'm like, can you double check for me? Just make sure on your end that you are sure, and then I'll be 100% on board. But let's go to the Lord and ask just to make certain. And I'm sure a number of people have had similar experiences of that in their own life as well. But Brian, I want to kind of talk about this canonization. Historically in the church, what has constituted a revelation worthy of canonization?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. It's differed over time. One of the interesting things is that in the history of the church, when the Book of Mormon is published, early members of the church basically almost immediately put it on par with the Bible, which was very unheard of in that period of time. It wasn't. I mean, there were different denominations that were doing interesting things with the canon, but to put something at the same level of the Bible was very radical at the time. But what they would do is Joseph Smith would usually call a committee together during his lifetime to kind of print the revelations. So they started printing them, and And then they compiled them first in the Book of Commandments, and when that printing press was destroyed later in 1835 into the Doctrine and Covenants. And Joseph Smith had a hand in picking out those revelations. He did it one more time in 1844. He added a few more revelations, and brought it up to, I'm trying to remember the exact number, but he added more. I think there was 102 originally, then it went up to about 110, 111. And then it wasn't for another 35 years that Brigham Young said we need to redo basically the Doctrine and Covenants, and he told Orson Pratt, this is your job now. And so he went through lots of the revelations that Joseph Smith had received. He also added many things that weren't necessarily, we wouldn't consider a revelation, like for our book. Like he added teachings that were written down in William Clayton's journal, section 130 and 131. He put in about 40% of the Liberty Jail letters, 121, 122, and 123. And so he did interesting things with the canon there that we don't know exactly why, but really it's kind of this prophetic dispensation, I guess, this call to someone to put these things together, and then the prophet and the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12 approve it and then present it to the church by kind of the law of common consent. So when Elder Pratt added these 26 sections in 1880, they voted on it in General Conference, and they gave actually the people 4 years of the new Doctrine and Covenants before they voted on it. So they had already printed it. Maybe Stephen could speak to they did the same thing with the Pearl of Great Price as well during that time. And one of the things which constitutes helps something become part of the canon is the popularity of the revelation, how well known it is. It's an interesting kind of criteria, but if people have been reading about it, say for instance, section 132, the saints have been aware of that for some time, the revelation on plural marriage and celestial marriage. And so if they were aware of that was in the milieu, it was being used often. And the same with the revelations found in the Pearl of Great Price. So if something was well known, used to kind of establish doctrine, it became kind of a prime candidate for canonization. So I don't know if that's helpful to kind of think about. But it's always been the prophet has kind of assigned people to work on this project, and then they've had ultimate a say so on how it's gone about. We can talk about the other periods when they did that. In the 1920s, they assigned a scripture committee to do the same thing. Elder Talmadge was on that committee, and they presented 20 revelations to add to the Doctrine and Covenants at the time. And for a long time, we actually didn't know what those 20 were until a few years ago. Elder Curtis, who's the church historian, gave a lecture at the Church History Museum and talked a little bit about that there were revelations from Wilford Woodruff in there and John Taylor, and the ones that would eventually come in our canon for the Joseph Smith's vision of his brother Alvin. So they presented that to the First Presidency in the 1920s, and all of them were rejected at that time. So it's our most recent iteration comes to the 1970s, but it's always brought on by the prophet, by a committee usually made up of apostles, and then brought to the First Presidency and then presented to the church.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but early in this council, going back to the 1920s, possibly earlier, is this the council that sort of decanonized the lectures on faith from the Doctrine and Covenants? Is that where this occurs?
Correct. Yeah, that's correct. And interestingly, so during Orson Pratt's project, the Doctrine and Covenants, he wrote to John Taylor and asked if he could take out the lectures on faith. So that had been something that was thought about for almost 50 years at that point, before it was decanonized. That's right.
Okay, that's very interesting, and I want to come back to this idea of decanonizing something in a moment. But Stephen, having worked on the Pearl of Great Price and the Book of Abraham more specifically, do you see a differentiation between how we might canonize something as scripture, like the Book of Mormon or the Book of Abraham or something like that, versus a "Thus saith the Lord" type of revelation we might see in the Doctrine and Covenants? Or do you kind of see them as going through the same process?
Well, they certainly go through the same sort of procedural process to get canonized. So at the same time that Orson Pratt does the Doctrine and Covenants in 1876, he also in 1878 does the Pearl of Great Price, and I believe also the Book of Mormon at that time as well. So he does the triple combination, and Pearl of Great Price gets sustained. Same session of General Conference where John Taylor becomes prophet is when they also sustain the new edition of the Pearl of Great Price. That's actually when it becomes scripture. That's an interesting sub question is the way the Pearl of Great Price is treated before it becomes canonized. It's treated as scripture, like the way it's quoted, the way it's utilized, the way it's referred to and spoken of. People are treating it as if it's already taken for granted that it's scripture. This just kind of, I guess, formalizes that decision. So mechanically speaking, in terms of the procedure to do it, they do the same thing in 1902 and then in 1920 and then 1976, I think. In the 1981. Like every time there's a new edition, the mechanical process has been the same. Whether there's like a qualitative difference between what's in the Doctrine and Covenants, these "Thus saith the Lord" revelations, and what's in the Pearl of Great Price, that becomes a lot more tricky to untangle, precisely because Joseph Smith, purports to render these texts by the gift and power of God through a revelatory or a divine method. And so guys like Orson Pratt take the Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Abraham specifically, he puts on par with like the Joseph Smith translation and the Book of Mormon and stuff in the Doctrine and Covenants. He gives lectures and discourses where he's like, these are all rendered by the spirit of prophecy and revelation. So in his thinking, they're all kind of the same thing. For the purposes of our book, we just thought it would be economical if we limited ourselves to what's uncanonized and what are "Thus saith the Lord" stuff, because the Joseph Smith translation is another question. What do we do with that, right? So here's a text that we have it in the manuscripts, translated by the gift and power of God, or translated by the gift of prophecy, right? Rendered by Joseph the seer. This language appears in the manuscripts of the JST. So, like, do we put that in with the Book of Abraham and Book of Mormon? Is on the same footing there, but it's not canonized. But we have stuff in our footnotes, but those are footnotes. But we also have sections in the Pearl of Great Price. Like, what do you do with that? So the JST is like in this liminal space. We decided to just like sidestep that because it's a huge other different project. And to focus on these little "Thus saith the Lord" statements, right? Or much more manageable texts you can kind of wrap your hands around. They're quantifiable. You can put them all together. So there's practical reasons why we sort of sidestep things like the JST. But to get to your ultimate question, Jacob, I'm not sure if there's a qualitative difference between ancient texts Joseph Smith purports to translate by the gift and power of God versus revelatory standalone texts he produces by divine pronouncement to different people at different times. It all seems to be kind of wrapped up under Joseph Smith's aegis as a prophet, seer, and revelator and translator, right? Is how these different things get produced. But the mechanical process behind what gets picked and when, I don't want to call it Calvin ball, but right, there was sort of it took a while to sort of unfold this process to decide what actually gets in the canon and why. Actually, the why, a lot of the time, we don't really know, other than the safe assumption is, well, it's coming from Joseph Smith, so it must be inspired. Like that's kind of like the underlining baseline assumption for most of this stuff, right? But the nitty gritty of why some revelations over others or whatever, I just don't know if we don't have access to those minutes. We don't know what they're talking about or discussing. We get some indication, maybe later discourses they might give or something, but nothing. So, for example, Bruce R. McConkie loves section 137 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Like, he's obsessed with it, even before it gets canonized in 1976, which is when it's put in the Pearl of Great Price. He's like, this is a revelation from God, right? Like, in his very McConkie-like way, he treats it like a revelation, like matter-of-factly. We know that he's the guy who kind of pushed it to have it get canonized, like what Orson Pratt would have done. So you just kind of work with what you've got with whoever is in charge of these scripture committee projects, right? So yeah, hopefully that gives some kind of a sense of what we do know. But it's difficult to get in the weeds too much until we get access to these meeting minutes, which would be really nice if we were able to sometime to really scrutinize what were they thinking at a given time when they're discussing new editions of scriptures. What do we leave? What do we take out? What do we put in, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I want to go back to Brian for a second because he mentioned a moment ago how this kind of process worked during the time of Brigham Young. Orson Pratt was a major influence over sort of spearheading this this idea of canonizing various revelations, going through all of these documents and revelations and trying to canonize them. And I wanted to bring this back around to this question, Brian, because when we look at the history of Brigham Young, his teachings, his revelations, there are various times in which he and Orson Pratt are very much at odds theologically, philosophically, and so it's interesting to me that he would choose someone like Orson Pratt to have this heavy responsibility. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about some of that relationship there, and maybe the implications of having two general authorities, a president of the church and an apostle who may be at odds theologically, coming together to work on this project.
Yeah, that's a great question. They did have a conflicted relationship, but they also respected each other a lot. There's this great quote from Brigham Young that said, "If you chopped up Orson Pratt into pieces, every piece of him would cry out that Mormonism was true." So he was often frustrated with him, but he knew his faith, and their personalities were very different. They went about things in a different way. Orson Pratt was very tethered to the prophet Joseph Smith, and as was Brigham Young, but he always tried to make everything align with the scriptures. So every doctrine that was taught from the pulpit, he was tried to show how the scriptures show that was true. Brigham Young was less so about that, right? He was, very much like that. I think he was learning whether his own pronouncements came from God or because he was the prophet, or was it his own thoughts, the doctrine of the church. And so I think he was at a learning stage, and sometimes Orson Pratt felt uncomfortable with that. But it's not to say that Orson Pratt also didn't speculate about lots of different doctrines as well. He did as well, but he was very much inclined to use the scriptures to prove the truth of all the doctrines of the church. And so one of the reasons that even though they had a conflicted relationship, Orson Pratt was a scholar, really, right? He was the details guy, the guy that's going to really get into reading into the books and to do all these major things. That's why multiple times in his life, Brigham Young calls on Orson Pratt to do hard things because he knows he'll do the best job at it, even if they didn't get along. The public announcement of polygamy goes to Orson Pratt, who had difficulty with it 9 years prior, right? And he's the one that Brigham Young says, "Hey, you're gonna basically announce this to the world." When there was problems with the Godbeite breakoff group, Brigham Young called upon Orson Pratt to say, "Hey, I need you to go give some lectures and tell them why this is wrong." Kind of the spiritualist movement, because he could trust him. And so when it came time to do the scriptures, he knew that there was no one better that was more invested and studious with the scriptures than Orson Pratt. And so he was kind of the logical choice. And I think Orson Pratt knew, and he had obviously some reservations about some of the teachings of Brigham Young, but he also was the first one to add a revelation from someone other than Joseph Smith. He added a revelation given to Brigham Young with section 136, the will and the word of the Lord. And he recognized how important kind of prophetic succession was to their claims of the truth. And so they kind of had a conflicted relationship, but they also realized how essential each one was to the perpetuance of the faith.
Yeah, awesome. So Brigham Young, being who he was, less theologically trained, is at this point learning how to recognize revelation himself. Do we start to see, and I want to bring this back to Joseph Smith, because that's really what this book revolves around, is his purported revelations. Do we see in the history of both Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and others the use of more "thus saith the Lord" type language more strongly towards the tail end of their, I don't want to call it a career, but towards their prophetic mission? Or is it kind of scattered throughout their life? And do we see maybe some patterns into how they would have, in their own terms, recognized something as revelation.
I'm not sure if there has been a like quantified study about how often these things are done. Maybe somebody has done that. I'm not familiar offhand, and so I'm not sure if we know if there's a pattern or not. I do know that we have a statement from Joseph Smith where he says it is a terrible thing to speak in the name of the Lord, right? Brian might know the reference, but there's at least one time when Joseph Smith on record kind of expresses some reluctance to do this, or maybe not reluctance, but some circumspectness, right, to do this sort of thing. And so when it does happen, that seems to be significant. Um, uh, as for Brigham Young, I think Brian is basically right that Brigham Young is the kind of, well, first of all, 19th century preaching culture, you have to kind of understand. It's rare when you get people that stand up with a pre-written out thing ready to go. In 19th century, especially like American Methodism, which these guys are coming up out of, right? Extemporaneous sermonizing is much, much more common. In fact, we know that we know this because they say it. Like when you get up to go to general conference, they'll say, "Well, I was just asked by Brother Brigham to speak in general conference. So I'm going to speak for the next 20 minutes." Right? Like, and so we get hints from the actual minutes, the audits of the sermons themselves that they're doing this. So Brigham Young, I think, I mean, we do have occasions where he speaks in the name of God. He pronounces teachings or things like that. But coming from his Methodist background, he seems to speak a lot more extemporaneously. And that's where Brian mentions this like learning process through Brigham Young is, and for us as well, is, you know, where does the slide grade go with this is a verbatim, you know, capture of God's divine pronouncements versus this is Brigham Young, who he called himself once like a Yankee speculator or something one time, right? Like kind of self-effacingly referring to his own method of preaching. So yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. Again, maybe somebody has done a study on this, right? To sort of see at one point in their prophetic ministries do they do this. I just do know that when Joseph Smith does do it, it tends to either end up in the Doctrine and Covenants or in books like ours, right? If it didn't end up in the Doctrine and Covenants. I do know that we do have cases where Joseph Smith makes like promises in the name of God, right? Like, or he'll make prophetic pronouncements in the name of God, but or you know, in the name of the God of Israel, I pronounce it, and that so and so will do this, right? Like, but those more kind of like predictions, I suppose, as opposed to or prophetic warnings, perhaps, as opposed to like revelations per se, right? In terms of recording divine speech. I know that like Joseph Smith liked to do that with his enemies, for example, right? He would predict doom and catastrophe on people like Stephen Douglas in the name of God because they were his political enemy or you know what have you. So that does crop up sometimes, but it would be interesting to do a study to find out how often that happened.
Yeah, that was a question that I've had for a little while, and I haven't been able to find anything that really touched on this particular question. So I figured I'd ask. But knowing that Latter Day Saints, we have a very strong belief in an open canon. Um, that means that we're open to receiving new revelation as it's presented to us as a church by the leadership of the church. Um, on the other side of that, that means that at some points in our history and even in the future, it is possible that things could be decanonized from our canon. We've mentioned already the lectures on faith, which I don't know that anybody necessarily considers to be a "Thus saith the Lord" style revelation because they're clearly not written that way. Um, but we do know at one point they were a part of the Doctrine and Covenants. In fact, they were considered the doctrine portion of the Doctrine and Covenants that were later decanonized. I'm wondering if, in all of your research, you've been able to find some other instances in which things were sort of decanonized from the tradition that have been built, whether it's the Doctrine and Covenants or something else.
Yeah, so I bet Brian was going to jump to the same example as I was, but the really big one is the statement on marriage that is in the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. It's prepared by Oliver Cowdery and a committee of elders in Kirtland, and it's tucked in at the back of the first printing of the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835. And among other things, this is the one that infamously says, insofar as the Church of Christ has been reproached with the crimes of fornication, polygamy, and adultery, we deny any such thing, right? So this is the famous denial that polygamy is being practiced in the church in 1835. That stays in the Doctrine and Covenants until they're removed by Orson Pratt, right? So it's in the first two editions done in Kirtland and Nauvoo. Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's Orson Pratt that removes that. So that's an instance of something in the Doctrine and Covenants that gets decanonized. The reason was obvious why that was. And without getting too much into it, it basically comes down to, well, after 1851, polygamy or plural marriage was an official practice of the church. And so it no longer made any sense to have that statement in there. There's also the fact that, and we don't have to get too much in the weeds of this, but this seems to have been kind of Oliver Cowdery at the last minute sticking it in there, right? That one in the statement on government that is still in the Doctrine and Covenants. That's what 134 in the Doctrine and Covenants, I think, or the Church's statement on governments. Those are both from Oliver Cowdery. Oliver kind of sticks them in there at the last minute, like almost literally right as it goes to press. They have the little meeting and they sustain this without Joseph Smith, by the way, who's out of town, and then they stick him in the Doctrine and Covenants. And one of those was decanonized. So the Lectures on Faith is a big one, but yeah, there's the article on marriage. Anything else, Brian, that you would probably know about?
I mean, I think that's it, unless you consider, Joseph Smith, basically his revelation on the Apocrypha, saying that, you can find inspired things in there, but that it's not necessarily inspired, as well as the Song of Solomon. But those are, yeah, but none from, specifically Latter-day Saint scripture.
Yeah. So this kind of goes into a more philosophical question about canonization, and there's I think a number of members of the church who would love to see something like the Family Proclamation be canonized, even though we kind of already treat it as such in a way, or at least many members do. And then there's many members of the church who would prefer to leave it uncanonized. Do you see any attempts by the church leadership currently to weed through some of these more recent documents and push them forward towards canonization, or is that something that is kind of more in the background, that we might not really be privy to any of that information?
I think that's probably the case. I don't have any insider information that that's happened. I've asked around, and I know that discussions of canon have arisen. That's kind of what I've been told, but not specifically for the Family Proclamation or anything else. So I know that, there's questions of canon are arisen among the brethren still. They have, an active scriptures committee that would probably help make those recommendations. But as far as I really have no other knowledge about what would be considered.
Nor do I, but what I can say is that if you look at how the Pearl of Great Price was treated for about 20 to 30 years between 1851, when it first gets published, to 1880, when it's canonized, if you look at how the Pearl of Great Price is being treated and you compare with how the Family Proclamation gets treated, the parallels are remarkable. Just in terms of how, kind of matter-of-factly people accept this as like authoritative or quasi-authoritative. They quote from it, they extrapolate on it, they cite it authoritatively for teachings and morality and practice in the church. They speak of it as revelatory. So there's general authorities who at conference have talked about the revelatory teachings in the Family Proclamation, or I think it was Boyd K. Packer that even went so far as to call it a revelation, right? That language gets applied to it. And this happens with the Pearl of Great Price for about that 30 years before it becomes canonized. So I'm not predicting the future, to be very clear, of what's going to happen to the Family Proclamation, but there's an interesting historical corollary or parallel with how the Pearl of Great Price was treated before it was eventually canonized, with how the Family Proclamation gets treated today. And so if we want to think of what the Family Proclamation is like, its status in the church, I like to tell people, imagine how the Pearl of Great Price was being treated in the 1850s before it got canonized. That's kind of gives you a sense of sort of where it stands in terms of its sort of authority, you might say, right, for the church as a whole.
I would say another example of that is Section 138, Joseph F. Smith's Vision of the Spirit World, where that was very prominent in teachings, presented in general conference, and was very popular among many members of the church as kind of, this is our doctrine on the spirit world and what's going on in there. So that's another example of that.